now tuned in to this week's episode of our podcast. And now, please welcome your host.
Hi guys, this is Ria here. So today for our podcast, we'll be talking a little bit about the empowerment of disenfranchised community members. And we have 4 guest speakers here. We have Andrew talking a little bit about low socioeconomic status.
Hey guys.
Shruti talking about immigration.
Hi everyone.
Ananya talking about older adults.
Hi guys.
And Colin talking about mental health and addiction.
Hello.
So I have a general question for all of you. Do you think that each of these communicated to one another?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the other guest speakers will also agree with me in that there's an extensive intersectionality between all of our distinct communities. There's definitely a discrepancy between them accessing healthcare, and this is what we are here to talk about.
Yeah, and I think that we should definitely keep in mind of the social determinants of health, right? And we have to keep in mind that these communities that we are all have expertise on are all generally blended together. They all mesh together in one healthcare system, right? And that is so important to keep in mind.
I definitely think that what we lack within all these groups, how efficient we are in approaching the needs of our individual groups. I think what we're lacking is not our strategies that we put in place, because we have many strategies. It's that we don't know how to turn it into an action. Majority of the times that's just because we don't have the funding for it. A lot of the times it's just not a huge priority for us.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of individuals can spread awareness, you can advocate, and you can educate, and those are a lot of things that are very beneficial, and they can have a very changing effect. But the thing is, we need to do things.
Right.
And I think there is a lot of initiatives that try, but there are bumps in the road that will be including funding or access to actual governmental change. There's things that we're trying to do, and I think later on we'll be able to talk about those solutions and what we can actually do later on.
Yes, definitely. As part of the conclusion, we will talk about the solutions as well. But before that, I wanted to know, is there stigma associated with, for say, poverty?
Yes, there is a large stigma associated with poverty, and once again, it does have a lot to do with each one of our communities, but I would say the stigma that's associated with poverty has a lot to do with, even as a child, being told to walk to the other side of the road, or as in poverty, your main thought is, they're going to use
cautious.
this. Yeah, to be cautious, or that you think that this is going to be used for something illicit. There's a lot of different stigmas that are associated with these groups, and I think it's really hard to overcome those barriers, and they have a lot to do with, let's say, in a healthcare professional, there might be a stigma that they're going to be institutionalized, and those are things that maybe don't allow the grant to access for healthcare for those individuals.
Yeah, and similar trends can be seen within the immigrant population. You can see that there's somewhat of a hesitance, somewhat of an alienation that they feel from the rest of the general community, and does play a huge barrier in them accessing and getting the adequate healthcare that they need.
Right. And I wholeheartedly believe that, because such limited access can be seen with people who have mental illness. We see people who have these, there's stigma related to that, and people think that their issues or their problems, they're untreatable. And so because of that, they tend to not have any advice, how can you have these things solved? How can you improve your situation? And because of that, we can see that there's so much discrepancy and inequality in the way that this community can actually receive care.
Yeah, I definitely think that the stigma in our groups is there, but it manifests itself very differently for each of our individual groups. So for older adults, the stigma is that they're very frail. There's not that much that they can offer to society. They kind of, become useless as what people think. And because of all these reasons, the stigma for older adults is that usually that they end up being the victims of polypharmacy. Which is just being prescribed way too many medications. A lot of these are things that they don't need. Overprescribing of medication. And I think it's just a waste of resources, and it becomes a health hazard to adults. So overall, I just think that we need to become a little bit more efficient in the way that we tailor these initiatives towards each of our individual groups.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. So can you talk a little bit more about ageism?
Definitely. Ageism has 2 components to it. So there's the socially constructed way of thinking about older adults, and I think a lot of it is based on the negative attitudes and stereotypes about aging that we put into place in our society. There's this nature in our structure of our society assumption that everyone is young and successful and fast-paced. And when I was talking to some of the older residents at the KW Senior Day program, they were talking about how they're pushed too much and rushed too much. And, when you look at someone, for example, who's 86 years old, they won't be able to move fast. And so we are in a time where we've acknowledged that discrimination is everywhere, and we have so many categories for discrimination, but I do think that ageism is something that people don't take seriously.
So are we really equipped to take care of our older population?
It's a tricky question. It's not a yes or no question. I think that public health agencies really try hard to work with the government and implement different policies and programs, but I think that the issue is less of our policies and programs, but more that we have these strategies, but because it's not a priority, we just aren't able to do anything about it.
Can you say the same thing about funding for immigrants, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So we see that with different seasons, governments tend to change their funding decisions for immigrants. So, for example, when a newly immigrant arrives in Canada, they don't have any healthcare insurance for the first 3 months. So they only have the emergency rooms as an avenue for them to accessing healthcare. This, I think, is a huge disservice because we can definitely do something more to make sure that they are healthy, contributing citizens of our society.
What about their health outcomes? So are they left off worse?
Yeah, so there's something called an immigrant effect. So in that, on average, immigrants tend to be healthier than the average Canadian, and that is largely due to the fact that they go through extensive medical screening before arriving to Canada. But once they arrive, they often take up low-paying jobs. They tend to score very low in terms of like social engagement and stuff like that. So their health outcomes tend to be worse than the average Canadian, for sure.
Thank you, Shruti. So on to you, Andrew. Would you say that with poverty suffers from poor health outcomes?
I would say yes, for sure. So a lot of individuals that are suffering from low socioeconomic status, their environment is a really big influence. As we said from Colin, looking at the social determinants, there's so many different effects that have to play with individuals living in poverty. One of the things that we need to look at is poverty is not only homelessness, but individuals that are living in a house that can't pay their bills. Even those individuals are suffering from low socioeconomic status. Maybe the cleansing of water in their own area. I know a lot of Indigenous communities don't have access to water. Those individuals that are living in low socioeconomic status have poor health outcomes because of their environment. So we see that has a lot to do with also the stigma that's associated with these individuals. We see that a lot of individuals don't want to access healthcare because of the stigma that's associated with them, such as being dirty or that they have an addiction. A lot of the individuals also lack a lot of necessities that they need, so such as sanitary napkins, tampons, things like that. So we see that there's a really high risk with these individuals for hygiene and hygienic health.
What about you, Colin? Would you say that there's stigma associated with mental health and addiction?
Yeah, definitely. There's a lot of stigma that's associated with mental health and addiction, and what we see that there's so many people who suffer through such as addiction and mental health, and they're unable to find adequate treatment. And so I think we should look a little bit more at some stats, so we could have some more context.
Yes.
Yes. So I think the CMHA highlights this pretty well, and 53% of Canadians actually think that depression and anxiety is considered to be an epidemic, and 56% of Canadians actually think that addiction is an epidemic. So we can generally see that this is a very big problem, because this statistic is so much higher than cases such as a stroke, being 34%, and diabetes 31%, HIV 13%. And so with 1.6 million Canadians with unmet mental health care needs, we see that we are not doing enough. We need to do more. And so the problem is that we aren't able to provide these patients with adequate care. We're not giving them an extensive effort in terms of care. And because of that, we're cycling these patients through an acute healthcare system. This is expensive for us, and this is not really effective for them.
I was gonna talk about solutions now, since you're saying a lot that we're talking so much about it, but we're not doing anything. So what is something that we can do?
I definitely think that wellness centers would be a huge solution. In my opinion, they address so many different issues all at once. There's that fear of social isolation, so it's a place for them to engage in activities. They also provide a lot of different services. So yeah,
I definitely think wellness centers are.
Likewise, for immigrant population rather, we can definitely have clinics that are more culturally aware and sensitive, that can meet their demands and their expectations, and help facilitate a strong physician-patient health relationship that will make sure that they have better health outcomes.
I think a lot of solutions that have to do with poverty would be including things that may be debated upon, but things like increasing the wage to $15 an hour will really bring a lot of individuals out from low socioeconomic status. Things like building affordable housing, as well as publicly funded childcare. So actually providing publicly funded care for children, as in 1 in 7 families actually living in poverty are having children. So that would really definitely benefit them.
Definitely for this community, the mental health and addiction community, we should definitely help them in with the solution by putting more of an annual budget into mental health and addiction care. We can ensure greater provision to make sure that we aren't cycling these patients through acute care, right? And this is like a stepwise approach. What we're doing is making sure that each patient is able to get the right care for their individual state.
Wow, thank you guys. That was very helpful and very knowledgeable, and I'm sure we can work a lot more on those upstream ideas and solutions that we've talked about. And that ends our podcast for today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for
Thanks,
having us.